Johann Sebastian Bach composed the musical offering in 1747 as a gift for King Frederick II of Prussia, who was an accomplished musician, a skilled flutist, and a composer. One of the many musicians employed at King Frederick's court was Bach's son Carl Philipp Emanuel, who's known today not only for his compositions, but also for his books on keyboard pedagogy, which were extremely influential. That May, Bach went to visit his son and his new grandson in Potsdam, making the long journey from his home in Leipzig. No sooner had Bach arrived in town than the king summoned him to the palace, not even giving him the chance to change out of his traveling clothes. Bach was famous for his skill as an improviser, and at that visit, the king asked him to improvise a fugue based on the following theme. Needless to say, Bach did a great job, and he wowed everybody with his improvised 3-part fugue, which you can hear next week in episode 2. That fugue and so much more was included in the musical offering that Bach dedicated and gave to the king 2 months after his visit. All 13 of the pieces in the collection are based on that same melody that Frederick the Great gave to Bach at their first meeting. This includes 2 fugues, a trio sonata for flute, violin, and continuo, and 10 canons, which comes to a total of about an hour of music. In the musical offering, Bach is at the height of his powers. He shows a seemingly endless capacity for invention. For this project, the members of the Princeton Symphony Orchestra have come together, virtually, to perform the entire piece for you. These performances, released in 4 episodes, offer you an opportunity to see and hear the players of the PSO in a more intimate setting than you would when they appear together as an orchestra. I'm pretty sure I speak for all of the musicians when I say that the day can't come soon enough when we're able to gather in person again for live orchestra concerts. But in the meantime, while we're all safely tucked away at home, I hope you'll enjoy seeing and hearing our marvelous musicians and getting to know this incredible work. In this first episode, we'll present 6 of the 10 canons in the musical offering. So what is a canon? A canon is a composition created through the imitation of an initial melody by another voice or by multiple voices, following a particular rule. The simplest kind of a canon is a round, like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, Frere Jacques, or Three Blind Mice. In a round, the voices sing the same notes, and they start after a consistent set interval of time. But there are lots of other processes that can be used to transform a melody so that it sounds good in combination with itself. One option is for the second voice to start on a different note than the first. Bach was a master of these kinds of contrapuntal processes. In his piece, The Goldberg Variations, which was published in 1741, just a few years before the musical offering, he wrote a series of 30 variations, and every third variation is a canon, based on the first 8 notes of the bass line of the opening aria. In each canon of the Goldberg Variations, the interval of imitation is different, getting progressively bigger. The first is at the interval of a unison, that is, the same note. Then a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and so on, all the way up to a 9th. Another canonic process is inversion, where the melody is turned upside down. In this case, if the lead melody goes up by a third, the next part that enters will go down by a third. So the voices are always moving in opposite directions. Still another option is a canon in which the lead voice performs the melody normally, while the following voice performs it backwards, starting from the last note. You can see we're getting into kind of musical freak show territory here. This process of going backwards is called retrograde, and it reminds me of palindromes, where the letters of a sentence read the same both forwards and backwards. For example, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama, or do geese see God? Part of the delight of this kind of word game is how weird it is that a sentence can have the ability to be read in either direction and still make some kind of logical sense. Yet another astonishing canonic principle is that of augmentation. in which the second voice plays the melody at a slower speed from the original, for example, half as fast. In the 10 canons of the musical offering, Bach goes through all of these processes, as well as combining multiple processes and combining multiple musical forms. It is really a virtuoso feat of composition. But there's another aspect to the beauty of Bach's work, which is seeing how concisely the information for the canons can be notated. Let's take a look at the first canon, the Crab Canon, and then we'll hear it performed by the trumpets of the Princeton Symphony. For the first canon, Bach uses the process of retrograde, or cancrescence, which means crab, and it refers to the backward motion of the second voice. Bach shows us that this is the realization of the canon by giving us the clef, the key signature, and the time signature, both at the beginning and at the end, showing us that one voice reads this way and the other reads backwards. You'll notice it's a soprano clef. This is a C clef, which shows us that the bottom line is middle C. And because both voices are using the same clef, they're going to be at the same pitch level. He probably just used soprano clef to avoid using too many ledger lines. The canon below is a realization of what was originally printed in the first edition. So this shows us the two voices together. The top line is our top voice, the first voice, and then you can see the last four notes of that top voice become the first four notes of the second voice. And it's absolutely identical. The second voice plays rhythmically and pitch-wise exactly what the first voice had played, but backwards. It's interesting to observe how the canon theme is different from the original King's theme. So if we look at the King's theme here, it starts off with these 5 bold half notes. Then a descending chromatic scale. It's a little square, then it speeds up, and then resolves back to the C. So in the Crab Canon, the first 5 notes are the same, but then he softens it using the syncopation. He leaves out the passing A, and he adds a continuation note to keep going to the second half. And then it goes off on this kind of accompanimental 8th note pattern. That place, that bar line where the 8th notes start, that's the midpoint of the canon. So you can see here it's the same E flat, the same C, the same D, the same E flat, and so on. There's a tradition with this canon of performing it one time as realized here, and then having both voices play their own part in reverse. And our performance, the trumpet players do that. So you'll know when they've switched direction because their images will reverse. Bach doesn't specify what instrument should play this canon. He just writes canon a due, or two-voice canon. So it begs a question, did he even intend for this to be performed? Maybe it's more of an intellectual exercise, and certainly Bach himself would have been able to hear this in his mind's ear very clearly. For the rest of us, it's helpful to actually hear it played, and it could be played by a variety of different instruments. It could be played by a 2-manual harpsichord, it could be played by 2 violins, or in this case, as you'll hear, by 2 trumpets. have noticed the inscription in Latin above the first canon, which I won't attempt to pronounce, but that means various canons on the royal theme. I didn't mention it earlier because it actually doesn't apply to the first canon. There are two different kinds of canons in the musical offering. In 5 of the canons, the king's theme itself is subjected to canonic imitation, what Bach described as a canonic elaboration of the royal theme. And in the other 5, the various canons on the royal theme, the king's theme appears as an independent melody with a 2-voice canon based on different thematic material constructed around it. This technique of composing a canon over an independent melodic line has a long history dating back to at least the 14th century. The crab canon we just heard clearly includes the king's theme, what Bach described as a canonic elaboration of the royal theme. But the 4 canons you'll hear next are of the other type, based on the royal theme. Bach's original order for the movements was changed when the musical offering was engraved for its first printed edition. This was probably done to maximize the amount of music that could be printed on each page, for example, by filling in the empty space at the end of one of the longer movements. In any case, Bach's original first canon of the group was moved, and the crab canon replaced it. We can see in the second canon that Bach specifies that the canonic voices are meant to be played by 2 violins in unison, that is, at the same pitch like a round. In the lower voice, you have the king's theme, and on the upper staff, the first voice begins. This little symbol tells us that when the lead voice gets to the downbeat of the second measure, the following voice starts at the beginning. And you can see this in the written out realization of the canon below. The writing in this canon is very flashy and very fun. It's very violinistic. This version of the king's theme, if we take a look at it, it's quite similar to the original. Like the crab canon, it leaves out the little A passing tone here, and it just includes the last 2 notes syncopated. The big change in Canon 2 is how it ends. It ends with a repeat sign. So basically the idea is that you could just keep repeating infinitely. It's called a perpetual canon. I love this idea of the perpetual canon, where the music just exists and it keeps repeating infinitely. It reminds me of like a pendulum that once you release it, it can just be free of friction and oscillate back and forth forever. It's really a very different concept of musical form from what we normally have, where there's a dramatic narrative arc. In this case, the music is more like wallpaper, or perhaps it's like our experience of daily life during a global pandemic. Since our performance needs to come to an end, the logical place to end is on the C at the end of the king's theme. And the upper 2 voices just try to gracefully trail off. In this performance, we have a bass playing the king's theme, and of course, 2 violins playing the canon. The title of this canon, Adue per motum contrarium, tells us this contrary motion is the governing principle of the 2 canonic voices. That is, where the lead voice goes down, the follower voice will go up by the same interval. We can see that this time, the king's theme is on the upper staff in the highest voice, with just 2 modifications. This time, the first 5 notes are quarter notes, which could imply either a slightly faster tempo or at least a little different feel for the theme. Also, here in the last measure, we have an E natural before the E flat. And you can see from the repeat sign that this is also a perpetual canon. The lower staff has two clefs, soprano clef for the first voice and alto clef for the second. The alto clef shows us that the middle line is now C. If you look carefully, you'll see that the flats in the key signature for the second voice are upside down. And this shows us that the second voice is meant to be read in inversion. This kind of canon in inversion is also called a mirror canon because it can be read by laying the music flat, placing a mirror perpendicular to it, and reading the reflected image, which turns the music upside down and produces the inversion. Doing this, you find that the first note of the second voice is a G in alto clef. The second voice enters when the first voice reaches the third note of the theme, as was also true in the canon for two violins. And you can see that Bach is really exploiting this contrary motion. The first voice starts with a long descending scale that's answered by the second voice in a big ascending scale. And there are lots of jumps around changing register. In this performance, the King's theme is played on the violin, and the two canonic voices are played by clarinets. As you may have noticed, the canons seem to be getting increasingly complex. This fourth canon is for two voices, and it uses two procedures simultaneously: augmentation, which slows down the speed, and contrary motion that inverts the intervals, like we saw in the last canon. In the copy of the musical offering that Bach gave to the king, he wrote, in rather grandiose language, "May the fortunes of the king increase like the length of the notes." Here the king's theme is on the upper staff in alto clef, and it's more elaborate. We can still trace the outline of the theme on the big beats. C, E flat, G, A flat, B. But it's been filled in with scales and arpeggios. The rhythm's also been modified, as you can see in this measure. These changes give the theme a more elegant and a somewhat more plaintive quality. You can hear this gentler character also in the lead canonic voice, which is notated here in tenor clef, so starting on a C. The second voice, because it's an inversion, again the clef is upside down, it's in G clef, so this first note is a G above middle C. You can see it here. Let's take a look at the augmentation of the rhythm. You can see the first voice begins with two 30-second notes, and the second voice replies with 2/16, so half as fast. You can really see this difference here in the second system, where the lead voice has alternating dotted 8th and 16th notes, which in the comparable spot for the second voice turns into effectively dotted quarter notes and eighth notes, half as fast. The end result of this difference in speed is that the lead voice plays through its material twice for every time the second voice plays through. You can also see that the lead voice goes down significantly. This C is an octave below the first note of the king's theme. And because the second voice is an inversion, it's going to go up above the king's theme here, going up to a high G. As far as listening pleasure goes, this might be my favorite of the canons. Each of the three parts sounds natural and lovely on its own, and they're just beautiful when played together. For For this performance, a violin is playing the King's theme, with a viola performing the lead voice of the canon and another violin on the second voice. Bach also included a personal inscription to the king before the fifth canon. This one reads, "As the modulation rises, so may the glory of the king." This is indeed a modulating canon, in which all three voices, the king's theme and the two canonic voices, finish each repetition of the canon a tone higher than they started, giving it the nickname per tonus. Let's take a quick look at the score to see how this canon works. We've got the king's theme on the top staff in alto clef. Notice that there's no key signature, since with all of these modulations, the necessary accidentals would quickly get very confusing. The chromaticism of the second part of the theme has now also been included in the first part, and we can still clearly trace the outline of the original theme. Then it continues the same way it had in the crab canon with the syncopation. Wait a minute, that is the moment of the modulation. In the original, this moment would have cadenced on a C, and here it cadences on the D, and then continues as if nothing had happened. This little squiggle shows us that the repeat's going to start on that D. So everything up a whole step. On the second staff, the two clefs tell us that the first voice will be in bass clef, starting on a C, and the second voice in tenor clef, starting on a G. So they're in parallel motions, but the second voice starts a perfect fifth higher. The second voice will start when the first voice gets to the sign, so the interval of imitation is one measure. We can visualize this more easily on the realization. So here's the king's theme, first voice, and second voice. Canon 5 is also a perpetual canon, and the fact of its modulating adds another aspect to its abstract beauty. After 6 repetitions of the canon, the voices arrive back in their opening key, but now an octave higher. And we can imagine the canon continuing to modulate endlessly higher, beyond the reach of our hearing, up infinitesimally high. However, we are limited by the finite range of our hearing and also finite range of brass instruments. The king's theme will be played on the trumpet, the first canonic voice on the trombone, and the second voice on the horn. This is the only canon that I transposed out of its original starting key of C minor. In our version, the players start and end on B flat, a whole step below the original starting pitch, which works better for the range of their instruments. The last canon in today's episode is the Fuga Canonica in Epidiopentai, a canonic fugue at the higher fifth. Like the crab canon, this is a canonic elaboration where the king's theme itself is treated contrapuntally. What's unique about this canon is that in addition to being a strict canon where the second part imitates the first so precisely that they can be notated on a single line, Bach also creates the more complex form of a fugue. It's hard to pin down exactly what a fugue is, partly because over time its meaning has changed. But typical aspects of a Baroque fugue are that there are at least two imitative voices, often more, and there's a larger harmonic structure that leads from the tonic, the original key of the piece, to a different key, often the dominant, the fifth scale degree, and then finishes back in the tonic, creating a larger harmonic narrative of leaving and coming back home. The music typically alternates between sections of imitative counterpoint, as you would see in a canon, that are then interspersed with passages of freer contrapuntal writing called episodes. Bach was a master of Baroque fugal form. In fact, our idea of what a fugue is largely based on his many fugal compositions. In 1722, Bach completed his first set of 24 preludes and fugues called the Well-Tempered Clavier, which he probably composed as part of the musical education of his own children. 20 years later, in 1742, with a new batch of children, he completed a second volume that followed the same format as the first, with a prelude and fugue in each of the 24 major and minor keys. Looking at the score of the Fuga Canonica in Epidiopentai, we can see that the printed first edition includes the canon on the upper staff and a free contrapuntal line on the lower staff. The two clefs at the beginning of the top staff show us that the first voice is in soprano clef starting on a C, and the second voice enters using this funny G clef that's centered on the bottom line, and that tells us the first note of the second voice is a G, perfect fifth higher. This makes sense because the title is in pente, which means a fifth higher, it's an ancient Greek term. This sign shows us that the second voice enters after the interval of 10 measures. And Bach is very clear about when this canon should end and how. He gives us fermatas on the bass voice and the first voice. And here he shows us where the second voice should end, also with the fermata. Bach didn't specify the instrumentation, but this canon is often played by flute or violin and harpsichord, with the right hand of the harpsichord playing the first canonic voice and the left hand playing the bass, as you can see in this realization. After the first voice plays the king's theme, there are 2 measures of transition, and then the second voice enters, playing the king's theme. This is followed by a lengthy episode until the first voice enters again, now starting on F with the king's theme, followed by the second voice, a perfect fifth higher, now on C, which is our tonic. Here Bach throws in an unexpected surprise. The bass voice, which up until this point had been playing free contrapuntal material, now enters with the king's theme too. This creates a dramatic moment of 3-part imitative counterpoint. In our performance, the bass line is taken by the cello, with the violin playing the lead canonic voice and the flute the following voice. One final noteworthy aspect of this canon is that the theme appears exactly as it had in Bach's original 3-part improvised fugue, the Ricercara Tre. And that piece will be featured in our next episode. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the musical offering and hearing the musicians of the Princeton Symphony perform these canons. Episode 2 will feature 2 more canons and the amazing Ricercara Tre, or 3-part fugue, that was Bach's improvisation that started the whole project off. I look forward to seeing you then.